Remember, remember, the 5th of November. The gunpowder treason and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. This rhyme is spoken every year on the 5th of November in the UK. But why? What is the meaning behind it? Before we jump on in, if you're new here and want to join this growing community, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure to check out my other content. In a nutshell, the Gunpowder Plot was supposed to blow up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening of Parliament on the 5th of November 1605, in hopes of killing King James I, and sick for Scotland, and the Prince of Wales, along with the other nobles and members of Parliament, in hopes of putting James's daughter, the 9-year-old Elizabeth Stuart, on the throne. Presumably so, she could be manipulated to the plotters' ideologies. King James was a Protestant. The conspirators who planned the plot were Catholic. So, here we can already see some friction and a potential motive. But we need to go further back than 1605 to fully understand why a man named Guy Fawkes and 12 other conspirators wanted to blow up the king. Since William the Conqueror, and you could argue even earlier, England had always been an undeniably Catholic country, right up until the reign of King Henry VIII. However, it was under Henry's reign that this plot arguably stems from. 1527 was the start of the king's great matter. Catholic King Henry was looking to divorce his Catholic wife and Queen Catherine of Aragon, so he could marry the Protestant Anne Boleyn. While with Anne, Henry was exposed to new ideology that he believed would benefit his cause. He was also surrounded by other reformists such as Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Between them, they basically controlled England and the Church. This time period would also see the Protestant Reformation and the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry closed the monasteries and they were raided of their lands and assets. Eventually, Henry would part ways with the Vatican, Rome, and the Catholic faith in England and set up the Protestant Church of England, which ultimately allowed Henry to divorce his Catholic wife. Although despite causing all this religious upheaval, Henry himself was never a Protestant. For the rest of his reign, England would teeter on this fine line between Catholicism and Protestantism, or Anglo-Catholicism, as you weren't really allowed to be too Protestant or you might be executed for heresy. But equally you couldn't be too Catholic and go against the king for the same reason. It was probably best just to keep your mouth shut. When Henry died in 1547, he passed the country into the hands of his son, Edward, who was a staunch Protestant. King Edward VI enforces a stricter Protestant England in the 6 years he was king, which, unsurprisingly, would have upset the Catholics, who were quite happily getting on with their life in the Anglo-Catholic England of King Henry VIII. But this is when the upset really starts. Edward tried to pass the Kingdom of England to his Protestant cousin Jane to keep the country's religion stable, but she only lasted for 13 days. Check out my video on Jane to find out why it was 13 and not 9 days. I'll give you a clue. It's called maths. Jane was overthrown by Edward's older Catholic sister Mary, who was the product of Henry's marriage to his first wife and Catholic Queen, Catherine of Aragon. You know, the one that sorted this whole baloo anyway because he wanted to divorce her. That one. So you'll probably be unsurprised to hear that Mary was a staunch Roman Catholic. She desperately tried to reverse her brother's Reformation in England and burnt many Protestants at the stake to enforce Catholicism on England, which gained her the nickname of Bloody Mary. So as you can see, England had been heading towards being a Protestant state from the 1530s, and then in 1547, England was pushed more firmly in that direction, and then 6 years later, everyone in England has received complete whiplash from Mary's complete 180. Fortunately for the Protestants, Mary died in 1558, and her sister Elizabeth, although a Protestant, took a more relaxed view like her father. having publicly told her subjects, "I have no desire to make windows into men's souls. I interpret this as, I don't care what you believe, just be useful to me, do what I say, and don't try to kill me." Which I feel like pretty good. But unfortunately, with the amount of Catholic plots trying to overthrow Elizabeth, especially from the 1570s onwards, she had to enforce a moderate form of Protestantism. Attendance at church became mandatory, and Catholics were driven underground. During the Tudor era, all the great stuff like the Armada happened under a Protestant ruler, while all the not-so-great stuff, like brutal deaths and burnings, happened under a Catholic ruler. Although it's worth pointing out that Mary didn't execute any more or less than the rest of her family. She just burnt more people, and beheading seemed a more humane way to die. As such, Catholicism was given a bad reputation, and many Catholics became victim of anti-Catholic propaganda. This isn't to say that Elizabeth didn't have her challenges. Quite the contrary. Her reign was plagued with Catholic plots, all of which went towards damaging the ever-blackening reputation of Catholicism in England. The Pope excommunicated Elizabeth in 1570 and declared that her subjects were freed from their allegiance to her, and basically gave them the go-ahead to go kill or overthrow her, and said that God would forgive them if they did it. There were also numerous plots between 1569 and 1586 to assassinate Queen Elizabeth and replace her with her Catholic cousin Mary Queen of Scots, which led to the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in 1587. Then there was the Spanish Armada, where Catholic Spain failed to invade us in retaliation for Mary's execution as well as other matters, and on the whole, Catholics in England were being viewed as the enemy within. You had no idea who was a Catholic unless they told you. They could be anyone, and if you did know, you would be suspicious of them, seeing if they were up to no good. It was like a real-life Marvel's Secret Invasion. When Elizabeth I died on the 24th of March 1603, many Catholics breathed a sigh of relief, as England's new monarch was going to be King James VI of Scotland, who was the son of the Catholic Queen Mary Queen of Scots. The Catholics hoped that James would show them leniency and be sympathetic towards them. His mother may have been a Catholic, but he was a Protestant. In fact, he had very little to do with his mother. James dashed their hopes very quickly. He continued to persecute Catholics, which led to several plots against James, including the By plot and the Main plot. The latter sought to kill James and install his cousin Arabella as queen. He signed a peace treaty with Spain, dashing any hopes of a Catholic invasion, and in 1604, only a year after being on the throne of England, he condemned Catholicism as a superstition, ordered Catholic priests to leave England, and fined those who refused to attend Protestant church. And this was the state that England was in leading up to the events that were due to occur the next year on the 5th of November. So now let's look at the man who is synonymous with the celebration, Guy Fawkes. Guy Fawkes' exact date of birth is unknown. It is thought that he was born in around early April of 1570, as there are records showing that he was baptised on the 16th of April 1570 at St. Michael le Belfray Church in York. Guy was born to parents Edward and Edith. His parents were Protestants. Now, History Extra says that Guy had two sisters that lived to adulthood, Anne and Elizabeth, while historical royal palaces said that Guy had two brothers called John and Christopher. And although both of these could be correct, neither source mentions the other set of siblings, and it's presented as if he has just brothers or just sisters. So he might have had two brothers, he might have just had two sisters, he might have had four siblings, two brothers, two sisters, I don't know, but that's really not important to the story anyway. At the age of 8, Guy Fawkes would lose his father, Edward. It's not clear nor really relevant how he died, but his Protestant mother Edith soon remarried to a Catholic man named Dionys Bainbridge. Ooh, Dionys. Ooh. The young Guy Fawkes was intrigued by his stepfather's religion, and in the late 1570s, early 1580s, it was a dangerous time to be a Catholic in England, what with Elizabeth being excommunicated and the plots against her, but despite the danger up ahead, Guy still converted to Catholicism. Guy attended St. Peter's School in York, and after leaving school he got a job in the household of Anthony Browne, Viscount Montague. Montague. At the age of 21, Guy Fawkes went to mainland Europe to fight for Spain against the Dutch in what would be known as the 8 Years' War. It was while he was in Spain that Guy changed his name to Guido, in an attempt to make him sound more continental and therefore more serious about his Catholic faith. And by 1605, he was also using the alias John Johnson. He would also develop his knowledge of gunpowder overseas, which obviously put him in good stead because by 1603, Fawkes had been promoted to captain in the Spanish military. According to his European allies, he was a man of great piety, of exemplary temperance, of mild and cheerful demeanour, an enemy of broils and disputes, a faithful friend, and remarkable for his punctual attendance upon religious observance. So a pretty good review, I'd say. Fawkes also supposedly was quite good looking. He was tall and strong, with a thick reddish-brown hair, beard, and a majestic, magnificent, matching moustache. On the 24th of March 1603, as mentioned earlier, Queen Elizabeth I of England died and passed her country on to her Protestant cousin King James VI of Scotland. James and Guy have something in common in the fact that they ended up following the opposite religion to their parents. That year, Fawkes petitioned to the Catholic King Philip III to go to war with England and the new Protestant King James I, but Philip declined Guy's proposal. While in Spain, Guy met fellow Englishman Thomas Winter. Winter, like Fawkes, felt the injustice suffered by English Catholics, and he was recruiting allies for a group of Catholic conspirators based back in England. The group back in England was led by Winter's cousin, Robert Catesby. Being the devout Catholic that he was, Guy Fawkes was a perfect fit for the group, and after years of fighting for Spain against the Protestant Dutch, Guy and Thomas Winter returned home to England in 1604, where Thomas introduced Guy to his cousin Robert. On the 20th of May 1604, Robert Catesby, Thomas Winter, John Wright, Thomas Percy, and Guy Fawkes met at a pub in Strand, London. Now, some sources say that it was the Dog and Duck. Others say that it was the Dog and Drake pub, but honestly that's not important. What is important is that all of the men were devout Catholics. All of the men, except Robert Keyes, were wealthy men. Robert Catesby, the leader of the group, was a veteran of a failed coup of 1601, and the charismatic mastermind. It was at this pub that he told the men about blowing up the king and Parliament. There were some reservations, but the 5 men all swore an oath on a prayer book and began to plot. Along with Fawkes and cousins Catesby's and Winter, the plotters included Winter's brother Robert, their brother-in-law John Grant, Catesby's second cousin Francis Tresham, his servant Thomas Bates, Fawkes' childhood classmates Christopher and John Wright, their brother-in-law Thomas Percy, Everard Digby, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes. So that was the name of all of the conspirators. For 18 months, Fawkes and the other 12 conspirators plotted how to blow up the House of Lords, kill the king and his heir, spark an uprising, and restore a Catholic monarch to the English throne by installing the 9-year-old Princess Elizabeth as a puppet queen and getting her to marry a Catholic. It was Robert Catesby who wanted the king dead, and a rebellion to follow. In order to blow up the House of Lords, they transported 36 barrels of gunpowder to the cellar below.
How many are there?
36. Counted them myself.
36? But last year I had 37!
They chose the 5th of November 1605 as the day they would ignite the gunpowder and their plan, as this was the opening day of Parliament. So, James and all the other targets would be gathered in one room. As the gunpowder expert of the group, it was Guy Fawkes' job to make sure that the explosion would be big enough to finish the job.
You're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off!
There is a view of a house in Lambeth that is often credited as being the residence of Guy Fawkes, but he never actually lived there. Awkward. The house was leased by Catesby and was used as the base of the Gunpowder Plot. Fawkes got a job as the caretaker of the cellar located under the House of Lords, under the name John Johnson, which would allow them to get the 36 barrels of gunpowder into the cellar unnoticed. The plan was that once James, Prince Henry, and Parliament had been blown to smithereens, Guy would escape by boat across the River Thames. The other 12 conspirators would start an uprising in the Midlands, kidnap the Princess Elizabeth, and have her marry a Catholic, and thus restoring the Catholic monarchy in England. The cracks in this foolproof plan started to show earlier than in November, and in fact, the first major crack happened in the October. On the 26th of October 1605, an anonymous letter arrived at Lord Monteagle's house advising him to avoid the state opening of Parliament. William Parker, Lord Monteagle, had his dinner interrupted when a servant brought him the letter which read, "My lord, out of the love I bear to some of your friends, I have a care of your preservation. Therefore, I would advise you, as you tender your life to devise some excuse to shift of your attendance at this Parliament for God, and man hath concurred to punish the wickedness of this time, and think not slightly of this advertisement, but retire yourself into your country, where you may expect the event in safety, for though there be no appearance of any stir, yet, I say they shall receive a terrible blow, this Parliament, and yet they shall not see who hurts them. This council is not to be condemned, because it may do good, and can do you no harm, for the danger is past as soon as you have burned the letter, and I hope God will give you the grace to make good use of it, to whose holy protection I commend you." It rejoiced in the thought that the bloodshed was deserved, and planned not just by man, but also by God. Monteagle was/had been a Catholic, or at the very least was a sympathiser. Priest Oswald Tesimond described him as a Catholic, at least according to his innermost convictions. Monteagle had also been in contact with Robert Catesby that summer, and had recently been imprisoned for his involvement in the Essex Rebellion of 1601. Unsurprisingly, he was under suspicion. This anonymous letter was his opportunity to prove his loyalty to the king. So he left his dinner party to give the letter to Robert Cecil, who was in Whitehall. King James was out of town on a hunt, but Cecil gave the king Monteagle's letter upon his return a few days later. Clever Clogs James deduced that the word blow meant that it was a warning about a plot to blow up Parliament. Brown-nosing Cecil, who had obviously figured it out prior, complimented the king on his intelligence, but either way they were correct. As mentioned earlier, this letter was anonymous, and even to this day we don't know who wrote the letter. However, various names have been put forward, such as Sir Francis Tresham, who was Monteagle's brother-in-law. Some historians have even suggested that it was created purely as an excuse to crack down on Catholicism, and that the authorities were already aware of the plot. Whoever the author of this letter was, they instructed the reader to burn the letter once they'd read it. But, as we know, he didn't. One of Monteagle's servants betrayed him and passed the news that he had not burnt the letter to Catesby. Unfortunately for the plotters, Catesby did not heed the servant's warning, and instead, he convinced his fellow plotters to continue with the plan, arguing that the letter was too vague to threaten their plans. On the 30th of October 1605, caretaker Guy Fawkes did his penultimate checks on the gunpowder. On the night of the 4th of November, under the cover of darkness, the 13 men brought in the 36 barrels of gunpowder and placed in a vault that Guy had the task of guarding until he needed to set it off. Robert Cecil ordered a search of the Palace of Westminster, headed by the Earl of Suffolk. During their first search, they found John Johnson, aka Guy Fawkes, in the undercrofts with a large amount of firewood, but left. It was only after, when they learned that the space was being rented by Thomas Percy, that they got suspicious. So King James ordered a second search, this time led by Sir Thomas Knevet. At midnight, Knevet and the Royal Guards searched the House of Lords, and in the early hours of the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes was caught red-handed with a fuse, a small lamp, a box of matches. And I'm going to read you exactly what it says here: 36 poorly hidden barrels of gunpowder. I wasn't there, they might have been well hid, they might not have been. But apparently they were poorly hidden. Fawkes was arrested and taken to the king. And oh my god, I've just realised why J.K. Rowling called Dumbledore's Phoenix Fawkes. It's literally spelt the same way. Apologies. Fawkes, the person, not the phoenix, was arrested and taken to the king. When asked what he was doing, Fawkes replied, "I wish to blow the Scottish king and all of his Scottish lords back to Scotland." Fawkes then expressed regret at his failure and blamed the plot's failure on the devil and not God. He was taken to the Tower of London and brutally tortured upon the orders of the king. The other 12 conspirators were arrested, except for 4 of them. Despite attempting to kill the King of England, James was apparently impressed with Fawkes' dedication to his faith, and for having a Roman resolution. Fawkes was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and over the course of the next 2 days, the 6th and the 7th of November respectively, he was brutally tortured. Sir William Wade, Lieutenant of the Tower, led much of the interrogation in the Great Hall of the King's House, a 16th century timber-framed building that overlooks Tower Green. At the time, any form of torture had to be approved by either the monarch or the Privy Council. So you'll be unsurprised when I tell you that James authorised the torture of the man who tried to kill him. King James I wrote the royal warrant. If he will not other ways confess, the gentler tortures are first to be used upon him, and then step by step you may employ the harsher, and so speed your good work. As you may have guessed from when I referred to it as brutal torture, the gentler tortures did indeed fail, and it's highly likely that Guy Fawkes was racked, presumably in the dungeons of the White Tower. Eventually Fawkes spilled the beans. He confessed to his involvement in the plot and signed a confession. As mentioned earlier, Guy had changed his name to Guido, and so he signed the confession as Guido Fawkes. If you compare his signature to the one that had been done prior to the torture, you get a sense of the pain that was inflicted upon him. It tells a story of a man who was pushed to the brink of physical pain and mental collapse. His confession, combined with the information collected through Cecil's spies, allowed them to uncover the names of the other 12 plotters. Cecil's men quickly moved to arrest them. Apparently, after his confession, Guy Fawkes remarks that he had gathered a large amount of gunpowder in order to blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains. The other conspirators had fled to the Midlands, while Fawkes was imprisoned in the Tower. The others were caught in the morning of the 8th of November. That morning, 8 of the plotters made a last stand at Holbeach House in Staffordshire. They faced a force of 200 men and were easily outnumbered. Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy were both shot dead. The others were arrested and taken to the Tower of London. Fawkes, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes were committed, tried, and sentenced to death under an Act of Treason. In January 1606, Parliament passed an Act for a public thanksgiving to Almighty God every year on the 5th day of November, also known as the Observance of the 5th of November Act 1605. It became mandatory for every church in England to hold a special service on the 5th of November every year. It was to celebrate the failure of the Gunpowder Plot and his deliverance from danger. These special church services included bonfires and fireworks. This observance of the 5th of November was in force until 1859, although celebrations do still take place today. Another tradition that still lives on today is the ceremonial search before the state opening of Parliament, when the yeomen of the Guards look for hidden explosives in the cellars of the Palace of Westminster. Despite being the first plotter to be arrested, Guy Fawkes would be the last one to be executed. Each of the conspirators, named earlier, were found guilty and sentenced to a traitor's death, which meant that they were to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. It would be on the 31st of January 1606 in Westminster that Fawkes, Rookwood, Keyes, and Winter were dragged behind a horse along the streets of London to Westminster Yard. This is the drawn part, where they were hanged. While still partially alive, they were cut down, castrated, dismembered, and beheaded. Their bodies were then cut into quarters and displayed as warnings to others, and for the birds to feast upon. According to accounts of the event, the men faced their fates bravely. Although hanged, drawn, and quartered rolls off the tongue better, I feel like it should be drawn, hung, and quartered, as that was the order that it happened. Anyway, a contemporary account recorded Fawkes' execution. Last of all came the great devil of all, Guy Fawkes, alias Johnson, who should have been put to fire to the powder. His body being weak with the torture and sickness, he was scarce able to go up the ladder. Yet with much ado, by the help of the hangman, went high enough to break his neck by the fall. He made no speech, but with his crosses and idle ceremonies made his end upon the gallows and the block, to the great joy of all the beholders that the land was ended of so wicked a villainy. It has been suggested that after the noose had been placed over his head, Fawkes tried to break his own neck, so he didn't have to suffer the fate of being castrated and dismembered while alive. The way we have celebrated Bonfire Night has evolved over the centuries. In 1660, Samuel Pepys recorded that the 5th of November is observed exceeding well in the city, and at night great bonfires and fireworks. A year later, Pepys, his brother, and a friend went to the Dolphin, where they sat late and drank much, seeing the boys in the street fling their crackers. That sounds like a euphemism. It was common in the 20th century to see fireworks displays, children wearing Guy Fawkes masks, or carting around Fawkes' effigy, begging a penny for the Guy. Bonfires would also accompany these activities. In many ways, Halloween, which is a few days prior, has eclipsed Bonfire Night as the main autumnal event. Nowadays, the religious aspect of Bonfire Night, and even Guy himself, have slipped out of the picture. Like, I can say myself that I have never, ever begged for a penny for the Guy. I didn't even know of it until I started researching this. Like, I was scrolling through and I'm like, really? That's a tradition? We do that? Okay. And I haven't seen people wear Guy Fawkes masks. Like, I know what they look like and I've seen them online and obviously in V for Vendetta, but on actual Bonfire Night itself, I've never seen anyone wear them. Nor have I seen anybody carry around effigies at the celebrations that I've been to. For me and the people that I surround myself with, it's now very much about the fireworks display. But this isn't to say that the old traditions don't still happen, because they do. But I do agree with the sources when they say that these old traditions are becoming less common. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. But until then, have a wonderful day.